The morning dawned gray and with a biting cold, with a frost that turned every leaf and blade of grass into silver. Aaron's breath clouded in front of him, vanishing into the crisp air as he stood at the base of a tall oak, securing the last strap on his climbing stand. The forest was silent, the world held in a frozen hush that only the forest could conjure. For Aaron, this was perfection. "This is where I belong," he thought, casting one last look at the ground before beginning his climb. There was nothing quite like being in the woods at dawn, the thrill of the hunt keeping him focused and alive. Today, he had his sights set on a white-tailed buck, a prize he'd tracked for days. Carefully, he positioned his rifle over his shoulder and began climbing, pulling himself up foot by foot. The stand creaked beneath him, but he knew the sounds well. He trusted this equipment as he would an old friend. When he'd reached a height that gave him a wide view of the surrounding forest, he settled in, breathing deeply, letting the frosty air sharpen his focus. He scanned the tree line, his eyes adjusted to pick out movement. In the first light, he could make out patches of dense underbrush, the kind that bucks love to use as cover. He imagined one stepping into view, and his pulse quickened with anticipation. For now, he was content to wait, his breath even, his senses calm. The trees around him stood like silent sentinels, their branches casting faint shadows as the sun began to rise. Everything felt still, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then there was a soft crack. Aaron froze, not a sound from the forest below, but from his stand. The metal groaned beneath him, and he felt a slight shift. "Come on, hold steady," he thought, trying not to move too quickly. He knew better than to panic. But before he could adjust, the creaking turned into a sharp snap. In one heart-stopping moment, he felt himself lurch forward as the stand gave way. The fall was quick, a blur of motion and terror, and then he was on the ground. A sickening jolt ran through him as he hit hard and unforgiving, the earth cold and merciless beneath him. All the air rushed from his lungs, leaving him stunned and breathless, every inch of his body ringing with pain. When he managed to catch his breath, he tried to sit up, but agony shot through his leg, forcing a guttural groan from his lips. Looking down, he saw his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, the sight enough to turn his stomach. He was hurt, badly, and the nearest road was miles away. He forced himself to breathe through the pain, assessing his situation. His phone was in his pack, but when he pulled it out, his heart sank. No signal. He was on his own. But survival instincts kicked in, and he took a slow breath, forcing himself to focus. First things first, he needed to stabilize his leg. He reached into his pack and found his knife, using it to cut strips of cloth from his flannel shirt. He grabbed 2 sticks, roughly shaping them into a splint, and bound them to his leg as tightly as he could. The pain was a constant, searing pulse, but he gritted his teeth, trying to block it out. His father had taught him the basics of survival, but this, being alone, injured, with a broken leg in the middle of the wilderness, was beyond anything he'd prepared for. "I just need to make it to the stream," he thought, remembering a small creek he'd crossed on his way in. If he could follow it, he might have a chance at finding a way out. But that meant crawling inch by excruciating inch over unforgiving ground. He took a deep breath and began to drag himself forward, his hands clutching at the cold dirt. Every movement sent new waves of pain shooting through him, but he pushed forward, his mind set on reaching that stream. The forest was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. It was an endless stretch of obstacles, each branch and rock a fresh torture. By the time dusk began to settle, Aaron had managed to make it only a few hundred yards. His body was trembling from the cold, and his leg throbbed with a relentless ache. He knew he couldn't make it much farther tonight. As the last light faded, Aaron huddled beneath a low-hanging branch, trying to shield himself from the biting wind. He gathered what little dry brush he could find and struck his lighter, watching with a fierce determination as the tiny flame flickered to life. He fed it carefully, nurturing it into a small fire that cast a faint circle of warmth and light around him. The forest was dark now, the trees looming like shadows in the night. He felt the primal fear that came with the darkness, a fear he'd always respected but never truly known until now. Every rustle in the underbrush, every creak of branches set his heart racing. "Stay calm," he told himself, clutching his knife. "Nothing's out there, just the wind." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He was in wild territory, and the fire, as comforting as it was, also made him a target. Wolves and bears roamed these woods. and a lone injured man with a weak fire was nothing more than easy prey. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter, wishing he could drift to sleep, but knowing that sleep could mean death. His mind began to drift, memories of his family flooding his thoughts. He could see his wife's face, her worry, her eyes full of warmth, his kids' laughter, the way they'd jump into his arms when he came home. I have to make it back to them, he thought fiercely. I don't care what it takes. The fire was dwindling, and he knew he'd need more fuel to keep it alive. Every muscle in his body protested as he crawled forward, gathering a few more twigs, feeding the flames with trembling hands. He couldn't let it go out, not tonight. Aaron lost track of time as he lay there, his thoughts hazy, slipping in and out of focus. The cold was relentless, biting into him despite the fire. He could feel his strength ebbing, exhaustion threatening to drag him into sleep, but he fought it, keeping his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the embers. At some point in the dead of night he heard it, a faint rustle in the darkness. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding as he strained to see into the shadows. Is that a wolf? He wondered, gripping his knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. He held his breath, every sense on high alert, listening as the rustling grew louder. A shape moved just beyond the firelight, a dark silhouette watching him. He knew it could sense his weakness, the fire barely keeping it at bay. Go on then, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Come on, I'm not done yet. He wasn't sure if he was talking to the creature or himself, but the words gave him a flicker of courage. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shape moved away, vanishing into the darkness. Aaron released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body trembling from fear and exhaustion. He lay back, staring up at the sliver of stars above, the fire casting ghostly shadows across the trees. He'd made it through the night, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. Pause 3S. When the sun finally rose, pale and weak in the morning sky, Aaron felt a renewed sense of determination. He was weak, his legs swollen and throbbing, but he was alive. With grim resolve, he doused the embers, took a deep breath, and began to crawl once more. Every inch was a struggle, the ground hard and unyielding, but he focused on his goal, one hand reaching forward, then the other. Hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion, but finally he heard it, a faint trickle of water. The sound filled him with hope, giving him the strength to drag himself forward until he reached the stream. He dipped his hand in, drinking deeply, the icy water reviving him in a way nothing else could. Just follow the stream, he told himself, focusing on each small, painful movement forward. By the time the second night began to fall, Aaron was fading fast. His vision was blurry, his hands scraped raw from the crawl. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, each beat slower, fainter. But then, as dusk settled, he heard it, a faint whirring in the distance. He looked up, barely able to believe his eyes as a helicopter appeared on the horizon, growing louder as it circled above him. With the last of his strength, Aaron raised his hand, waving, praying they'd see him. He watched, hope flaring as the helicopter turned, hovering directly overhead. Rescue had found him. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this story. Be sure to hit subscribe.